Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us. You're in for a treat tonight, a big treat. We've got a panel discussion talking about the challenge of Islam. And on the panel, we've got Chris from Speaker's Corner, David Wood, Old Hickory, who will have to introduce himself, and Vocab Malone. So it's going to be a good panel and hopefully a great conversation. We're going to be looking and discussing about how the church can respond to the challenge of Islam politically, socially, culturally, and economically. And I want to make it clear right from the outset, this is not about hating Muslims. And I'm quite confident that none of my speakers are going to be doing that. And if they did, I would correct them on it. But rather it's talking about the encroachment of Islam and Islamization upon different aspects of our society. It's social constructs, it's culture, it's politics, it's economics. Sometimes as we discuss this, it may seem disheartening. It may seem that the challenge is something that is too great. But the point about talking about a challenge like this is so that we can rise up to it, and rise up to it, as it says in Romans 8, as more than conquerors. No one should watch this video and feel that the responsibility lands on them alone. We're doing this video because all Christians need to respond to this challenge. All Christians need to deal with it. And so it's an entire church response that we're discussing. Whilst there are obviously other challenges that we could be talking about, and other challenges certainly do face the church, I would argue against anyone that this is in the top 5 of the challenges that face the church. And so it is a legitimate topic of conversation for Christians. Now, I would also argue that this is the kind of conversation that we should be having in our churches, rather than the kind of fluff and drivel that often passes for church concerns and church issues that we see in lots of congregations across the West. So, without further ado, I'm going to bring in the panel, and Chris, who you know from Speaker's Corner, David Wood, who is singularly the biggest apologist for Christians on this topic on YouTube, Vocab Malone, who needs no introduction, and then Old Hickory, who probably does. So, Old Hickory, would you like to just introduce yourself to the group and to our audience, who probably may not know you?
Okay, sure. I've been, I would say, a serious Christian for about 3 years, and you can call me Old Hickory. That's the name I use on the internet, but Brother John is fine as well. I'm a member of Christ Forgiveness Ministries that's headed by David Lynn, who's on a European tour at the moment. But I also want to say that even though I share those beliefs, I'm speaking for myself tonight, so not as a representative of the church, so to speak. But I would say I'm like a lot of Christians in the West. I grew up in the mainline Protestant church, had good experiences early on in the church, but then got into the world and lived my life that way, mainly chasing after money. That was my idol. And then a few years ago, I was humbled in that area, and I started to come to faith. And since that time, I've been for the last couple of years, I've been a street preacher, kind of growing in that area and apologetics. And I'm here in Dallas, Texas, so that's kind of where I've been planted. And I'm just looking to grow my faith and the fear of the Lord, and blessed to be able to share this panel with all of you.
Okay, thank you so much. So, guys, let's get the ball rolling. As you all heard the brief before we came into the studio, in terms of how I want this conversation to go. I just want to sort of, throw some things into the mix to try and sort of start to stimulate the conversation, thinking about the kind of political challenge that Islam represents to the church. So, for instance, there's the politics of Islamophobia and the idea of pushing Islamophobia as an actual agenda, violent jihad that we see both in the West and across the Islamic world, low-level intimidation that we're starting to see in the West, influencing of policymakers, influencing of government, the persecution of Christians abroad, seeking to movements and efforts to establish aspects of Sharia law in the West, the establishment of Sharia law courts, and particularly one for Europe, maybe not so much America, is large-scale Muslim migration and immigration to the West. These are just some of the ways in which Islam is presenting a challenge to the church. And, who would like to sort of get the ball rolling and jump in thinking about the nature of the challenge, how we can respond to it, and any other thoughts?
Sure.
I can totally jump. Go on, Vocab.
Vocab, then Chris.
Well, brief. As you guys know more than anybody, it's nothing new. The challenge is nothing new. Obviously, there's new versions of it and all that. But thinking about Islam as a religion, as a civilization, if we want to use that term, it's advanced through a variety of ways, right? It's kind of a diverse program. You got patterns of violence, you got supposed intellectual and perhaps subjectively, but nonetheless aesthetic appeal. And that would include even sort of emotional elements that people find appeal with. Obviously persecution, so not always just violence, sometimes the threat of violence. Persecution is, as you just mentioned. Incentives as well. It's heavily incentivized. And even sometimes what we might call charm, I'm not saying that it's sort of anecdotal, but you think about what some people are talking about in India, the love jihad, and there or even poetry. But there's all kinds of things put together, and this has been going on for a long time, and Islam continues to find various ways to spread. And I would say for better or for worse, but I think we all know it's for worse. And so just bringing that out to remind everyone listening, not to the panelists. I'm never talking to the panelists. They know what they're doing here. I don't. But in all seriousness, it's a lot going on, and we'll try to cover some of that today. So I'm sometimes overwhelmed by it, but I'm glad I'm with the Lord, because that's the only solution. And we're going to talk about what it looks like today.
Yeah. I think the thought that it is in essence an alternative civilization. That's what we're being offered, and a civilization. And this is why I wanted to frame it in terms of politics, economics, society, and culture. And you actually padded it out in a much more articulate way than myself, Vocab. Is that it's offering us a different way of being a human being than we know historically, and it isn't a new challenge. This has been, they've attempted to force it on us in the past for 1400 years, but it isn't a new alternative. It's a 1400-year-old alternative. But I think that one of the big differences between the past and now is that and this is going to be the big elephant in the room, I suspect, throughout this entire conversation, is that we're now in a post-Christian society, a liberal society, whereas the Christians of the past were very secure and firm in their sense of a civilization. And they were very much, no, actually, we've got a civilization to offer you. Whereas liberals or progressives, particularly today, are kind of doubtful of the inherent goodness or value of Western civilization, and therefore don't seem to want to get into what they could be called culture wars or a civilizational conflict.
You know, Bob, you could actually, I've occasionally pointed this out, but I mean, it's to the point where we can start actually making an argument and appeal out of it, right? That, you know, for say what you want about Christians, for 14 centuries of Islam, all the dumb stuff that Christians have done during that time, whatever disagreements Christians had with each other during that time, for 14 centuries, Christians said, whatever else we have going on and whatever else we may disagree about, we are not going to be controlled by that over there. We're not going to do it ever, under no circumstances. Are we going to be controlled by that? Because once you go that, you're not going back, right? So Christians understood that. And then, of course, you get to the modern idea, you know, hey, we're going to be post-Christian now. And all of a sudden, people can't hand over their civilization fast enough. And so it's like, hey, guys, what, you know, as much as you look back on Christianity being in charge, we're looking right now to see how you guys do. Because you say you could do it better, and really looks like you're just gonna like burn it all to the ground. That's what it looks like. And we're gonna burn everything to the ground in the name of tolerance and so on.
Chris, sorry, I was meant to come to you and I forgot. I do apologize. Go on.
Yeah, no worries. As you can imagine, I have quite a few opinions about this. So just to kind of add, I think one of the core tensions we're now in, because of the way politics has gone, the way culture has gone, we now have a progressive culture that has overvalued a kind of virtuous individualism, to the point where what you are as a person is not defined by your, let alone your community, even your family necessarily isn't really what's important, but instead you are. And as long as you're tolerant to the point where you won't reject anything, you are going to accept anyone, no matter who they are and what they believe, you are considered a good person. And I think what we have a responsibility as a church to do is to actively break this sort of house of cards down by simply asking questions, such as, okay, we are liberals in this world. We desire that women should be free. How do we reconcile that with an Islamic belief? How fundamentally do we do that? And you may even not actually be even that direct. You may simply say, you know, I've known someone who thinks it's okay to have more than one wife, and they don't think that women can have multiple male partners. What do you think about that? Like, in a progressive worldview, what do you think? And every part of their being will call out that that is not acceptable. Every part of them will, because everything in them has been raised through their entire lives in the modern age to reject any kind of oppressive thinking. And they associate that, ironically, with an old form of Christianity. Whereas what they don't realize is that this is actually the Islamic view that is now coming, that they need to be able to understand and reject, but they have very little knowledge of what the Islamic view actually is. And I think that's one of the key issues.
I think that you're right to say that we should be challenging the liberal naivety around Islam. The problem with and one of the challenges to achieve that goal is to burst that bubble of naivety. Is how do you not get cornered into being called an Islamophobe or a racist?
Exactly. I think that's a core part of it. And I think how we do that is we ask questions and we refuse to do anything else. Like just initially. Like there are other ways you can do this. I'm talking like on a personal level, right?
the conversations you have with your coworkers, people in your family, whoever it might be, the person down the street. But when it comes politically, then obviously, or you're talking about institutions, then that's a different question. But what the individual can do is simply say, hey, I've heard that in Islam, you can do X, Y, and Z, or this is permissible, or that in this religion, this is the case. And it can't be something really offensive. I'm not talking about Aisha. I'm not talking about those kind of very deep and problematic areas. I'm actually talking about the very obvious, undeniable aspects of Islam that even the most virtuous liberal will agree is a part of Islam, because they already know it. It's in the media. So when you present that with them, you say, look, how do you reconcile this? And I've done this through my own experience. And you realize very quickly in the way they respond that they don't have a solution to this. And you can see this, I don't know how familiar you guys are, but in Britain, we had an issue where there was schools that were advocating for effectively teaching homosexuality in their core materials at a particular school, right? And this caused an outrage among the Muslim community. So the simple question that you can go around asking them is, okay, so how do you reconcile your liberal value for homosexuality with the Muslim understanding that this is something completely haram and forbidden? And by asking these questions, yeah.
And I think that cuts into the fact that politics sits downriver of culture. And one of the reasons, because in the UK, guys, just in case you don't know, in the UK there are minority parties that have tried to raise awareness about the political dangers of Islam, but they just get instantly sidelined as alt-right, extremist, racist, nasty nationalist kind of parties. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I've not really spent much time to investigate them. And what that tells me is that we've got to increase the education of liberal society around actually what Islam does. And I think that part of that journey, part of winning that cultural narrative battle, is to draw attention to the 1400 years of persecution of Christians in the Middle East. Because we have a living example of what it looks like to live under Islam already. The Coptic Church, the Assyrian Church, the Ethiopian Church. All of these churches have had living experiences. The Armenian Church have all had living experiences of what it is to live under Sharia law, and to sort of use those as living examples and to enable and to encourage those churches to speak up for their own suffering. Everyone's either deep in thought or
No.
There's a good book about some of this. It's 2006, so it's kind of getting dated by now, but Londonistan, I'm not living in the UK, but there's an excellent chapter. I think it really dovetails what you're talking about, specifically chapter 4, the multicultural paralysis. And it talks about a small town called Dewsbury, and how, on one hand, they're worried about the curriculum being Eurocentric, and there's this big kerfuffle about that. But meanwhile, the town is where Mohammed Sadiq Khan came from, the leader of the July 7th suicide bombing situation. And you have that, and it's a really interesting set of things going on over there. And I like these two paragraphs. I think they're fascinating. And, you guys, again, I'm not telling you live there, but to the audience, as a book you can get a hold of, quote, "These snapshots over time of one British town illustrate a trend that has transformed the whole of British life during the past 4 decades, one which has drastically weakened it from within to the threat from without. That trend is multiculturalism, the doctrine that is now the orthodoxy throughout all the institutions of British public life. Put at its simplest, it holds that Britain is now made up of many cultures that are all equal and therefore have to be treated as in an identical fashion, and that any attempt to oppose the majority culture over those of minorities is by definition racist. This doctrine was a complete break from the earlier tradition of assimilating immigrants, which itself arose from Britain's once robust sense of and pride in its national culture and history. The break occurred because a series of developments shattered Britain's confidence in its own integrity and, deeper still, its very sense of what the nation was." Does that encapsulate it well?
Yeah, it does. I think to sort of broaden out this concept, and then I think, John, you wanted to come in.
Sure.
It's kind of like liberalism presents a third civilization in this matrix that we're now all in. Is we've got liberalism as one civilization, Christianity as a second civilization, and Islam as a third civilization. And it's like, who's going to win out in the matrix? Go on, John.
Yeah, I see it is kind of a battle for truth versus kind of like a pleasure quest on what people are trying to live their lives. And in the secular West, you kind of see some divisions that you'll see, like the atheistic scientists or those who believe in kind of scientism, and they kind of prop that up as their God, and that they're trying to seek some truth through that. But they'll deny God. They'll believe there's like a higher order, but they'll deny God. And then you have a lot of folks that I run into that are kind of ambivalent, and they've just kind of bought into things that they like to hear, or about not to receive Christianity as the truth, and so they will kind of live their life in a nihilistic way, and so it'll be very their decision making will be very momentary, moment to moment decision, what feels good in the moment, not thinking about 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And we've seen the effects of that in our society. And I would say even though we've with Muslims, that we would agree with a lot of the same things, like, we believe there is truth, we believe that God exists, we believe in miracles, but we just disagree on who God is and what happened on the cross. But they still have a tendency, in my opinion, to still have a certain nihilism and carnality about them, at least for men. I don't think it necessarily carries over for women in the same way, but for men, I could see why some people were mentioning Andrew Tate, why that might appeal to him with the life that he seems to lead. And so I think those are some of the challenges we deal with as far as battling that hedonism that's out there. And I think the solution to that is talking about truth, preaching about truth, speaking about the sacrifice that Christ did as the antidote. Because I feel like the West is going to eat itself. I think we're already seeing that. And Christians simply have to answer your other question, simply have to stop caring. So what if they call you all these ist names? So what? We have the truth in Christ, and that's what we need to stand on, and come what may. And we just simply need to do things that will allow us to be able to do that, with communities, with families. So you're less able to be canceled by a culture that is trying to suppress the truth. So,
does anyone want to reply before I jump in? Because I am always quick to give an opinion.
Oh, I just wanted to add something. Real quick. Earlier, I mentioned that for 14 centuries, Christians said, "Hey, we're not gonna be controlled by that." And a lot of it was an intellectual response. I remember the first philosophy class I ever took. When we got to Thomas Aquinas, the professor said, "Hey, what do you guys know about Thomas Aquinas?" And and no one knew anything. And he goes, "Well, you should, because he's the reason you're not all Muslims." And so it's basically you go back to that time, and Muslim scholars were brought into Europe because they had studied the texts of Aristotle, and then they started using that in the universities in order to start giving people a more favorable view of Islam. It was actually Aquinas, who I was told back then understood Aristotle better than anyone before or since, who then started using Aristotle to critique the claims that the Muslims were making in the universities and so on. And so, and totally shifted the climate back then. But basically, Christians have always found a way to say, no, we don't want to be controlled by this. Not all Christians, because some Christians did get crushed by it, but other Christians are actually paying attention, saying, hey, we need to make sure this doesn't happen here. And then when you get this shift to all these different positions are, need to be treated with equal worth and equal validity, to the point where if someone comes from Afghanistan and moves to Europe, it's viewed as bad to try to change his ideas about things, when there's a chance that guy has some of the most horrifying views that would contradict everything you hold dear. And so you might want to rethink that. But notice what happens when you go that route. When you go that route of, hey, we have to treat all these things like there's no differences here. Then what happens when one of those groups start organizing rape gangs and pedophile gangs and drugging, raping, gang raping, pimping 12-year-old girls? You got to keep quiet about it, because you can't have anyone viewing that group differently. So it affects everything. It affects what politicians do. It affects how journalists work. But it's like, I mean, what further evidence would you need that you got a problem in your thinking? I'm talking about, Western liberalism here. What greater evidence could you possibly have that there's a problem in your thinking when you've basically reverted to the ancient pagan world, where you offer up your daughters as sacrifices to your gods and goddesses back then, but to your ideology now? Like, hey, if we have to hand over all our 12-year-old girls to this ideology, then so be it, because that's how important it is to us. But yeah, man, really it's a wild situation that you could actually watch this almost like a movie, sitting back going, okay, here's this group that says we're going to be inclusive to anyone who doesn't agree with us about accepting everyone. And then here's this group that comes along and, hey, we're going to beat women into submission, and we can take your daughters as our captives, and Jews and Christians are the worst of creatures, and we have to fight them whenever possible. And here's how this works. When we're in a minority, we're going to be all about peace and tolerance. But as our numbers increase, we're going to get increasingly more aggressive, with the goal of ultimately violently subjugating you all. And we're sitting there, these two things are colliding right in front of our faces. And I don't know. It's whatever else happens, it's going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Can I just
get in real quick? I was going to say, I think the way that we deal with this, or we take a step to dealing with this, is that we plug in the vacuum that there is on what Islam is, because I think a lot of people, particularly in the West, simply don't have a realistic understanding of what Islam teaches, and the fact that what it produces when you allow it to come together in groups, into communities. We're at a position where there are communities of Muslims in the UK, and they very much live in their own isolated communities. And that works for them, because that isn't kind of like the Christian church, which is a lot more divided. It's much more widespread. You can find much more churches than you'll find mosques, but you probably won't find as much of a congregation size in each of these churches. Whereas with a mosque, you might find only one, but a lot more Muslims are going there. So you end up with a situation where you have two different cultures existing side by side. And if you want to break this down and to have this kind of conversation, you need to be able to bring them together in a way that allows for an honest conversation to happen. And I think one way of doing that is to just bring up these common issues that we just keep seeing over and over again, that isn't really popular in the media, but needs to be talked about. What do you do when liberal values are simply not accepted by the community that lives there? Like, what do you do to that? And then when you ask these questions, you get people to think, I wonder if it's because the people there think something radically different to how I think, and that doesn't work with my liberal perspective. And then once you've planted that seed, all of a sudden you've got someone who's now critically thinking. They're not thinking virtuously. They're not thinking politically correctly. They're thinking honestly.
And I think that is a really important point, which is that liberalism, or our current form of liberalism in the West, has no critical filter when it comes to Islam. And I think it doesn't have a critical filter when it comes to Islam because it conflates categories. It sees Christianity as a white man's religion. It sees Islam as an ethnic minority religion. And therefore, because it conflates these categories, any criticism of Islam to the progressive is a form of racism. Racism is one of the blasphemies, one of the blasphemies of the age, and therefore you can't be racist, so you can't have a critical opinion about Islam, and so it prevents a critical assessment of Islam. But I think that in terms of getting, trying to throw out the contrast between liberal values and Muslim values, as Christians, we mustn't fail to actually present an alternative of Christian values to both. And often, wherever we have the opportunity, we should present ourselves as the moderate, sitting in the middle between two extremes. So one example would be about dress, and particularly dress for women. In liberalism, it's anything goes, up to and including barely no clothing at all, and the objectification of the woman's body. And then on the other hand, within Islamic values and Islamic tradition, in some of its worst cases, you have the absolute obliteration of the female form in the public space and the disappearance of women in the public space, as has already been documented in parts of suburbs in Paris. And whereas Christianity encourages modesty, but it's not ashamed of the female form. You know, women have a place in the public sphere and should be seen and should be there and should be seen evidently as women, but not just sexualized. You know, and I think we shouldn't just say, look, liberals, your values conflict with Islam, but we should be saying, look, liberals, Islam and you aren't going to get along, but actually we've got something better than both.
Exactly. And I think the beautiful thing of that is that we're kind of already at that position. Like if you took the average person and you say, okay, is it a good thing that women, they're going out, they're going to these nightclubs, they're not dressed particularly modestly, they're getting drunk, men are taking advantage of them? They will immediately say, yeah, I don't think that's a good thing. And then you can say, well, what if we say that women have to cover themselves almost completely and we enforce this by law? And they'll say, no, that's a horrible thing. That goes against all my values. And then you say, well, yeah, what about we simply say that people should dress modestly, but people should also have the independence to act as they wish. They can make mistakes, but we should encourage good, modest behavior. And I'll say most people, I think, would say, yeah, that's exactly what aligns with my views. So I think to talk about the Christian view in the current age in the West is actually quite simple, because you can talk about the Christian value side without actually having to reference that you're actually really just taking a Christian position. They might not even be aware that that's what you're doing, but because of the Judeo-Christian worldview that they've been brought up in, even though they're largely, perhaps they've abandoned it for progressivism, deep down they know that that's kind of correct. They know that the middle ground is that perspective. And I think you're right. We can take advantage of that and really encourage that.
Yeah. I just want to wear my moderator's hat on for a second and just say that, you know, for instance, for those of you that perhaps are not from the UK, David was earlier referencing rape gangs. And the thing is, in the UK, we have had industrial scale levels of rape of children by Muslim grooming gangs that was covered up in the UK. So that's what he was talking about. And it's important to state that not all Muslims buy into what Islam teaches. You know, but what we're talking about is actually what Islam teaches, as opposed to necessarily what the Muslim next to you at work may think, you know. So just bear those two distinctions in mind. Any other thoughts, guys?
I think that you mentioned part of, I mean, the solution will be multifaceted, but you kind of mentioned it partly when you mentioned that the idea of the Christianity perceived as a white man's religion. Well, that's a falsehood, simply by the fact of a lot of immigrants that are pro-Christian here in America. There are a lot of Hispanics that are clearly not quote unquote white, that are very strong believers. And that's going to be a big focus of the church going forward in the future. Same thing, there are a lot of Africans, same thing in the UK, that are strong believers as well. And so I think that type of needs to be pointed out, and that's probably where the direction of the church is going to go as well. That's part of the antidote to that type of claims. Like, you can't call us racist when we're obviously belong to a multi-ethnic church, and you know, it's self-evident because you can see them in our congregation, you can see them when we evangelize, and you can see that that we're growing churches there. And I think that's part of will be part of the strength of the church, is meeting the needs of those immigrant groups that are already in the fold, already have some of these stronger beliefs of having a family, not ashamed to have children, and less influenced by the plagues of the West, that kind of hedonism. And so I think that's at least one part of the solution. But obviously we can talk about a lot more than that too. So.
And just, to the audience, it is, one thing that was brought up was directing women's dress in Islam. That's not just a perversion of Islam or a stereotype. This is Surah 24:31. And here you're going to see the Quran is going to command the women must do this. Quote, lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty in ornaments except what must ordinarily appear thereof, that they should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty except to their husbands, their fathers, end quote. And then a few others are allowed as well. And then you have a situation where Muhammad was seen, Asma, who was the daughter of Abu Bakr, came to see him, and Muhammad said this to her, "Oh, Asma," this is a quote here, "when a woman reaches the age of menstruation, it does not suit her that she displays her parts of body except this and this," and he pointed to her face and hands. And so, it's directly from the sources. So if you wonder, well, why is it that we see the women with only their face and only their hands covered? Well, that's because that's what he told Abu Bakr's daughter. So, that's from the sources, because you always get, these things like Islam is the most free of all religions. Like in LA, there's a group called the Muslim Women's League, and they claim, quote, that spiritual equality, responsibility, and accountability for both men and women is a well-developed theme in the Quran. Spiritual equality between men and women in the sight of God is not limited to purely spiritual religious issues, but is the basis for equality in all temporal aspects of human endeavor.
By the way, it is interesting how Islam always ends up playing both sides of the fences here on every issue, right? Like, you believe in women's rights, or you believe in feminism or something like that, then Muhammad was the greatest feminist of all time. You need to convert to Islam because he's the one who told the West that women have rights and so on. You hear that one. And then if you're dealing with people who are worried that women are out of control and women, this feminism is making them crazy and so on, what's the solution? Islam, right? Now it's Islam will put the women back in place. We'll save you from these out of control women. And it's like that. It's like that on pretty much every issue. So here in the UK, here in the US, different, of course, from the UK, and different from Europe in several important senses. Like multiculturalism hasn't been as bad here as it has been over there, because the traditional American value is called the melting pot. Right. It's people come from all over the world, but they melt together into one thing. They don't, people don't come and then just like stay whatever they were before. So, sometimes they do. Like I lived in New York, and in the Bronx, you'd go over here and there's like people from this area. You go over here, there's people mainly from that area and so on. But the overall mentality was that it's in Europe, it's almost like the overall mentality is it's bad for things to melt together into one thing. You got to keep them separate, or they've been polluted it's like they all get watered down if they melt together. Whereas here it was viewed as good. It's like, hey, people come from all over the place, but it melts together into this one new thing. So there are differences, but there are similarities in that, with politicians aligning with things that should be very, very different from what they're saying their values are. So here, Muslim politicians, we've had several. So Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Keith Ellison. The Muslim politicians are almost always extreme far left, so extreme pro LGBTQ, all that stuff. And being put forward as look at Islam. If you have this idea of tolerant to the point where you can't reject anything, then Islam is what's for you. Come to Islam. When those of you who know Islam, you're looking at that going, what? That's not Islam. Yeah. What are you even talking about? But then when people get like up in Michigan, where you have these disputes over what's going to be taught to, in kids, and what kind of books are going to be in their libraries at schools and so on. Now you have Muslims and Christians all going to the school board meetings and complaining about things. And Islam, of course, at the dawah level now is being put forward as, hey, Western society can't stand up against these things. That's why we need to Islamize in order to protect you from all this stuff. It's like, wait a minute, you guys are the champions of it, and you guys are the only defense against it. And somehow it comes down to that on every issue. And it really seems like, hey guys, whatever you happen to like, we're going to tell you that Islam is what you like.
It's the Muslim,
even if it's not, even if it's the opposite.
That's how the Muslim Brotherhood gained traction in Egypt, is that whatever the problem was, they said Islam is the answer. And they're following that strategy here in the UK as well. And the reality is they've got a jump on the church in that, and I'm going to criticize the way that Christians do evangelism in the West, because one of the things that we could learn from Muslims, certainly in the West, is to present that part of our Christian worldview that is most attractive to the audience. Unlike in what they're doing in Islamic Dawah, where it's literally, we'll just say whatever, because you don't know anything about what we actually stand for. So on this side, we'll say we're pro-LGBT and freedom. We're not going to persecute you or turn you into dhimmis. But then on this side, we'll say that we will, and that we're the only people that can stop LGBT agenda. And they're basically packaging Islam to the audience, but they're only getting away with the lies and the deceits because liberal society doesn't know. But I think that Christians should be doing something similar without the lying bit, but presenting that part of the Christian faith that is attractive to the audience. Whereas what we tend to do in the West is we just have this attitude that says, oh, all we need to do is preach the gospel, talk about Jesus Christ crucified and his resurrection, and that's it. We just put that out into the atmosphere, and that's all we need to do. And I think that is not a great way to do evangelism. And actually, we need to be engaging with the culture on the questions that it wants to talk about from the position of our faith. And I think part of the reason why Christians do so badly in this regard is that because of the Enlightenment and the withering effect of the Enlightenment upon the church over the last 300 years, most Christians don't know a full fat version of Christianity. They know its doctrines, but they don't know its history, its ethics. They might know some of its values, but they don't know its ethical system. They don't know its history. They don't know its customs. They don't know the traditions, the kind of things that emerged out of this Christian milieu. And if they do, they often worry that somehow embracing them is a distraction from the gospel when it's not.
And but by the way, it's you can look at all of this and say, the impact eventually is going to be good. So in other words, if you go back to the early centuries of Christianity, Christians had to know why they believed what they believed, right? Because if you're going to go out and you're going to convert to this thing, which is just going to cause you problems and get you persecuted, you weren't going to do that unless you knew why you believed. And so Christian apologetics, knowing why you believed this, was built into it. You weren't becoming a Christian without knowing why you believed in this. Whereas eventually Christianity becomes so successful that everyone around you, if you're in Europe or the United States, a few decades ago, everyone around you is a Christian. And so you're not being challenged on why you believe these things. Everyone believes. You're not being challenged on why you believe in the Bible, why you believe in God. Everyone around you believes in these things. The two categories of people who believed it and followed it, and people who believed it and didn't follow it, right? There were still plenty of people who weren't following it. But if you went up to them, hey, do you believe in God? Of course I do, man. Do you believe in Jesus? Of course I do. Well, why? So you were able to preach the gospel like that. Hey, why aren't you committing to something that you already believe is true? And so after you go through several generations of this where Christianity is not challenged in any significant sense. People no longer know why they believe any of it. It's just, hey, this is just what was passed down to me by my parents. Apologetics isn't built into it anymore because you don't need that. Polemics aren't built into it because there's no one around you who's a threat. There's no one knocking on the door who's gonna challenge you on these things. And so people, they have no clue. And then all of a sudden you get all these emergency situations that arise and people have no clue what to do. I mean, they could be intellectual challenges. Now you have an atheist. Hey, do you know that the reason you believe in Christianity is because your parents believed? I'm like, yeah, that is true. I was never given any reason. I just believed it, right? Because there was no need to anymore. There was no need to actually defend it or prove it. But then you have all the other challenges, like the challenges from Islam and the moral, cultural challenges and so on. And Christians just aren't ready for it because they went for so long. They went for centuries without being challenged on a lot of these issues. And so the point of all this was you could look at this as good as far as like waking up the church and forcing us to get back to basics and fundamentals and to start being what it used to be, right? In the early centuries where I follow Jesus because I know enough about Jesus to think, hey, if I'm going to listen to anyone, I'm going to listen to him. And if you have some evidence to challenge me on that, well, let's go ahead and have a discussion. I know what I'm talking about on this. And so, basically getting back to that, people knowing why they believe these things.
Any other points, guys? I'm gone.
I was going to say, I think that I'm sure we all agree with that. I think the challenge that we have, though, is because we live in a secular West now, is where can we raise our voice and have credibility? Because as Christians, we live in a culture where if you speak strongly on some of these subjects, you will be ridiculed, you will be canceled, potentially worse. So you'll get run out of academia potentially. And so these things make it a little more difficult as far as when we can find our places to make our stand, so to speak. So that's another thing that we, in the past, that we had, but we've now, I would say, we have lost that. I mean, you get somebody like Frank Turek, who lost his job when he was in a Fortune 500 company because he spoke out on gay marriage, essentially. And that's not that uncommon. I mean, most of us, if you had a regular job, if you spoke freely, you're working for someone else, there's a risk they could choose to let you go because some folks complain. And so these things create other challenges, right? If you're in academia, you're a strong Christian, you may be stunted where you can't have that growth. So you have to make a choice on whether you're going to follow the convenience of getting tenure and all these advantages, or because you may have a family and kids that you have to take care of economically, or choosing to truly fear God and defend the faith, even though if that means you may not be able to get those advantages. And those are choices Christians now have to make in a very serious way. And I think that'll be increasingly the case.
I think, speaking directly to that, if there's one move that Christians can make as a collective, as a body of people in the West, that allows us to address in one move as many of the problems that we face, of which this topic is just one, the move would be to abandon the way that we're doing church at the moment and to create Benedict communities. And what I mean by that, there's a book out there called The Benedict Option. I encourage everyone to read it. I'm a 100% convert on the thesis that it presents. And what that means is that Christians need to consolidate. And particularly with Islam, we see the failure of the parish system or the mega church or the independent church in the face of the Benedict option, because Muslims use the Benedict option. They consolidate into a single geographical space. And then what happens is that one independent church or that parish church or whatever it is that is usually there, over time, that church closes and then gets turned into a mosque. And it isn't that the entire congregation converts to Islam. It's just that over the course of the decades, some people move out, as you do. A sprinkling of people will convert to Islam, inevitably. The church itself might even convert a sprinkling of Muslims to the Christian faith, but then most people in that church will die. But because they're surrounded by this giant Muslim population and they can't penetrate into that Muslim population to replace the numbers that are being lost over the decades, eventually the church closes. So sociologically speaking, Benedict option beats independent parish church every single time. But that can work in the reverse as well. The Benedict option works for whoever uses it. And it can work for Christians as well. And I think if there's one move that we can make as Christians that will strengthen our hand and allow us to regain some kind of initiative in society, culture, politics, and economics, that's the one to make.
Yeah, I think there's some legitimate value in that, because and there's certainly Christians here that I know that they've already moved out of the city, which is where I live, and they move out to the country where they feel their neighbors are more open to the Christian message, or they're kind of building these, they're not communes, but communities that are supportive of Christian ideas, because the belief they can more influence the local politics, the schools, and have more political power in that way. And I think that's certainly true. But I don't know, and it'd be interesting to hear Vocab and David because they're different parts of the U.S. on what is the climate Christians feel on that. Do they? Because I know some Christians are believing we're in the end times and we need to act accordingly and protect our families. But I don't know if that's an urgency that's spread across the U.S. And so it'd be interesting to hear some other folks' perspectives. And since I'm not as familiar with the U.K. also, like how, because you asserted that plan, but I'm assuming you believe in it, Bob, but like, when are you going to put that into action? Where you're saying, folks, we need to go to the countryside or wherever you think that you need to make your stand as a community. So kind of open it up for other folks.
All right, guys, I just want to remind you, you can ask direct questions to one another just in case you forgot. And obviously you can challenge one another as well if you hear something you disagree with.
So I got one question real quick. So regarding the Benedict option, the first thought that actually springs to my mind is, what do you think of the equivalent of communities that are not based in particular areas, but rather actually just online? In other words, we focus on bringing together communities of like-minded individuals who are interested in propagating the gospel and to reaching those who have not heard it, and to do polemics, apologetics, and they're willing to do it in such a way that they demonstrate the fullness of why this is in and of itself a proper good thing, a virtuous thing to do, and to encourage others to get involved in it. Because I think you're right. I think I can't remember who mentioned it, but the idea that, yeah, you're going to face serious persecution if you come out and you start saying all these Christian things, particularly at your workplace, if you're involved in any institutional politics. But what you can do now, and what we have the position to do now, is we can do whatever we do in our normal life. And yes, we have a duty still to preach the gospel, but we don't necessarily have to talk about Islam so much. But as soon as we come online, then we have the freedom to actually advocate what we want. And we can cultivate an online community of people who are no longer afraid, because they're seeing us all do this, to go out there and to just confidently say, yeah, Islam is wrong. And we're gonna show you exactly why. We're gonna make funny videos about it. We're gonna do all these things, and that's one way we can reach people, because that's not as risky to our own personal lives.
I think. Are you asking to any particular person?
Just throwing it out there.
I mean, personally, I think networks. I think in terms of organizing, if you can address a challenge on your own, you should do so. If you can't, you do it in a group. If you can't do it in a group, you do it as a congregation. If you can't do it in a congregation, you do it as a network of congregations. If you can't get a network of congregations, you just do it as a network. Eventually, you just build up the necessary numbers of people to meet any challenge. But the problem is, this is a civilizational challenge, and it's got two dimensions to it. How do we deal with liberalism? How do we deal with Islam? And it requires the entire body of Christ to be motivated to address this challenge in the way that it stands. And that's about changing, I think, and this is part of the solution, It's about changing the agenda of what the church thinks is important and changing the agenda of what the church is placing as its priorities.
Is that your dog, Vocab?
Yeah, is it that loud?
Pretty
bit.
loud.
My
It's all right.
goodness.
We like dogs.
Okay.
As far as Christians, forming groups and so on, it's kind of everything that's going on is kind of set up for that right now, because you have I read about it. It was talking about a wolf, not in the bad senses of like a wolf coming to steal sheep or something like that, but just in nature, a wolf can live on its own, or a wolf can live as part of a pack. And a wolf living on its own behaves in one way, but when there's some sort of outside danger so that it joins a pack, it starts behaving differently. They have a hierarchy and so on. And so people are like that too. And that if you have a person and that person is, living his life and focusing on raising his family and working and building for the future and so on, that person behaves in one way. But if that person is suddenly feels threatened or in danger, the tendency is, okay, I need to be part of a group that's going to give me greater protection, just from a psychological perspective. But what happens is, when a person joins a group, there's pressure to agree with everything that the group teaches. Because as soon as you join a group and you start questioning this or that, then the group itself will, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing in here? You're challenging that? Oh, are you on their side? And, they point to their enemies and so on. So there's just this massive psychological pressure to then adopt all the ideas of the group. And so the reason that that can be a really bad thing is when everyone right now, because everyone feels like they're under some sort of threat right now, right? The left, it views itself as in danger from the right, and the right from the left, and every religion out there, if you're Islam, everyone's attacking us and so on. If you're the church, hey, everyone's attacking us. And so there's a tendency to say, okay, what group am I going to join? And the reason that can become rough is, I need to join this political party because they're gonna fight against that. But now I have to agree with everything this political party says, or I'll be cast out of the group and so on. So what you have is, you join the group and the group is heading in a certain direction, but people are stepping over each other to not be left behind. And so they have to constantly be adjusting their thoughts to conform to the group and so on. And so the problem that Christians are going to face is they're going to have this inclination to join groups that are going to protect them from something that they fear most, but simultaneously adopting things that don't, if you're a Christian, they don't actually fit in well. And so the option, the group that you should be a part of is the church, right? That's where you should be going, not to this guy or that guy, or I think this person's channel or something like that. It's good. It's the church should be the refuge here.
And I John, I know you want to jump in. I just want to encourage you, if you need to jump in, jump in. Don't be like waiting until if you want to jump in on a point, and I'll moderate if I need to. Did you want to say something?
I was just saying but we can see that as one of two ways, as a concern, or we see that as an opportunity. Because I view that as the West is making all these mistakes. People are experiencing that in their life. They believe the lies of Hollywood, and that you can fill your life with all these little adventures and excitement, and you're going to have this wonderful life. And they're discovering that for some women, that career maybe wasn't that important. I really should have had a family. And as Christians, there's opportunities there where we can point that out to a public, so they're open in a way they wouldn't have been before. And so we can kind of knock back some of those claims that, Christians were just, we're living out the Handmaid's Tale or some other nonsense like that. And so I just think there's opportunities to reach folks in that way, because people, once things get uncomfortable, and things are getting more uncomfortable, I don't want to say words, so I'll get this live stream in trouble, but certain things that people had to deal with, they're not as comfortable. It wasn't as easy a life as it was, say, 20 years ago, and things like that. And so that creates an opportunity because people are like going, hold on, something's wrong, and they're willing to question things, and that's an opportunity. And so if Christians are strong in their faith, and they're letting that guide them, if they do that fear of God, then that'll show, and they can motivate people. But I do know what David's talking about as well, because here on a political angle, you're kind of pushed to choose one side. And my opinion is that both political parties, neither one of them serves Christian principles, and they lack certain things which people recognize. But I do think there's opportunity there that Christians can take advantage of, where they can reach people, or wouldn't have been able to 20 years ago, when people start to see the cracks in some of these beliefs that are being said.
And by the way, it's just a quick point here, because earlier I mentioned that you could view this as positive, in the sense that if it makes Christians get back to a point where they understand why they believe in Jesus and take it seriously, then it's good. But also, what's going on right now you can view as good, because you're seeing the failure of a position, right? It's for a position that's been building for centuries now, and people are seeing where it's ultimately leading and going, wait, this is actually insane. If you adopt that and you have nothing else other than this idea, or collection of ideas that you said is ultimately going to, make the world a better place. And now, right now in our generation, we're seeing the breakdown. So we're seeing the real life refutation, the practical refutation of a set of ideas that were supposed to, trump Christianity.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. Guys, I'm going to put my moderator's hat back on, and I just want to. We've done an hour, and we've kind of nibbled a bit around the problem. We've offered some solutions, and we've dissected some of the problem more. I want to try and spend the last hour, and I'm not shutting down any aspect of the conversation. If you want to revisit things, or you want to bring in new aspects. My initial idea of breaking it down into politics, economics, social, and culture, it was an idea, but it clearly hasn't worked. So, it's open gambit to talk about any aspect. But I'd really like us to, in this last hour particularly, to focus more on the solutions and more on the response. And whilst everyone's been talking, I've been writing down some ideas of of some of the ingredients that would form a response. And this is just to get your own minds working on other suggestions or other thoughts to stimulate conversation in that direction. And these are some of the points that I've made. So one of them is that as Christians, we need to more clearly distinguish ourselves from liberal culture, liberal politics, and liberal philosophy. That we need to recover as Christians a strong sense of our own confidence in our own identity as Christians and in the project of a Christian civilization. That we need to be thinking more politically as Christians, and that we need to be mobilizing the whole church, not just leaving it to specialists. That we need to present a Christian alternative to multiculturalism, and say that there is a way to organize society that isn't multicultural, but isn't some kind of ethno-nationalistic fascism either. That we need to emphasize what distinguishes us in our theology and in the way that we talk and in the way that we do churchianity, to emphasize what makes us distinctive as Christians, rather than emphasizing that which makes us the same as everybody else. Because if you emphasize that which makes you the same as everybody else, you have no way to, you've got nothing to invite them to, but you also have less ways to resist the invitation to Islam. That we need to recover a spirituality of martyrdom and recover a spirituality of that which can, supports and leads towards martyrdom and the spirituality of the confessor. We need imaginative activism on every front: artistic, cultural, political, philosophical, political, economic. That we need to be building up groups that we need to be building up groups within the church to meet the necessary challenges. And as David says, we need to be presenting the solution as being part of the church rather than looking to the state to solve everything. And as part of that, I would say that we need to be separating ourselves from civic national identities and emphasizing more the fact of our Christian identity over a civic national identity. And we need actually to create an alternative economy, because one of the things, to use David as an example, you kept suffering with YouTube's laws. So you then created your own system by which you could put into YouTube, but they couldn't get you out, kind of thing. So those are some suggestions that I've thought of as we've all been talking. And I want to try and steer our conversation now more towards the response. So I open up the floor to anyone who wants to come forward with their ideas, or come back on some of these ideas, or to pad any of these ideas out, however you want to take the conversation forward.
What's cool is you see biblical responses to the various kinds of challenges in the New Testament, because Christians still had to deal with not the same issues, but similar issues. But you talk about early on, you started with talking about the various challenges that Islam presents. So it's like the challenges, it's plural challenges. So if you think about the different challenges, one of them are, one of the challenges is that Islam specifically rejects core Christian doctrines like the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, the divine nature, the Trinity, and so on. And so it's actually denying certain doctrines and then replacing them with others. And so notice that's one kind of challenge to the Christian church. It's challenging with ideas. And then you have, as far as Islam, keeping people from ever seriously considering the gospel. I mean, Islam, from the time a child is born, is indoctrinating this kid to ultimately reject the gospel, and does that by, with the ideas, but also by various kinds of pressures. Like I've known lots of Muslims who understood that if they leave Islam, their family's going to cast them aside. And of course, in places that, are still Sharia compliant, but even here in the West, you always have to wonder if someone's going to take it seriously, that Muhammad ordered his followers to kill apostates. So, we present the gospel and we say, hey, here's the good news. Here's the good news about Jesus. And what a Muslim is hearing is, wait a minute, you want me to believe this thing that, according to my religion, would be a one-way ticket to hell, saying that Jesus is Lord. That would be shirk. That would be the worst sin. And I have to give up my family for it and maybe get my head chopped off because, guys, that sounds like the worst news ever, not the good news. So you have that. And then you also have the various political challenges. Like there are things that the church needs to do. There are things that a government needs to do, right? If there's a terrorist attack, the government should be stepping in there. If there's some insane jihadi who's got a nuclear bomb, the government needs to be stepping in to deal with that. And so you have all of these different challenges that Islam presents, but you can see Christians dealing with all of these. So if we're talking about Islam denying the core teachings of Christianity, or Islam presenting people with false information about Muhammad and the Quran to get them to convert, well, notice that's apologetics and polemics right there, right? So we're supposed to be able to defend our claims and to refute false claims. So notice there, you're not talking about getting violent. You're not talking about politics or anything there. That's just, hey, this is how you're supposed to deal with bad ideas. You refute them. So you got apologetics and polemics. Then as far as the various kinds of pressures that Muslims put on people, if it's just Islam saying, hey, you will burn in hell if you say that Jesus is Lord, that's another issue for apologetics. But the other issue there, that you may have to give up your family. You may have to give up your family Muslim family. They'll turn their back on you if you leave Islam. I mean, that was built into Christianity. That's why Jesus had to tell his followers, hey, those of you who've had to give up a lot in this world, you're going to get a lot more. And he said in this world, and what that, I mean, at least what I think it means is if you say, hey, I have to give up my family's casting me aside. Well, guess what? You got this much bigger family now. That's something I had to deal with Nabil when he was like, when his family he was having problems with his family after converting. And I just tell him, dude, we're your family now. Yes, you still got your family. And I hope things go along. I hope you get along with them and everything goes well. But don't lose the sight of the fact that you have a really, really big family right now. And that needs to be somehow built into people's just background knowledge when they're even considering the gospel. Oh no, what if I believe in the gospel and then I have to give up my family? They have to know, hey, if your family turns their back on you, guess what? You've got a much bigger family now that will take care of you. And then the political issue, of course, you even see that. You even see like the Apostle Paul when they were trying to railroad him and take him up to Jerusalem because there were people who were gonna murder him there. He said, hey, I appeal to Caesar. And so you've got the Apostle Paul saying, hey, I appeal to my government to protect me because it's the job of my government in this situation to protect my rights as a citizen. Yeah. And so notice there, Paul even says, if I've done something deserving of death, I do not hesitate to die. He says in Acts 25, says, if I've done something deserving death, I do not hesitate to die. But if I haven't, no one has a right to hand me over to them. In other words, he's telling the government, you have no right to throw one of your citizens under the bus. You don't have that right. You have no right to interfere with my basic human rights. And so following that example, I think we can make appeals to our governments and saying, guys, here's what you need to be doing. You need to be protecting people's rights because there is an ideology out there that really wants to take some of them away.
Does anyone else want to jump in? Because, like I say, go on, John.
Well, I was going to let Chris or Vocab's away, but Chris hasn't had a moment to speak. But
I'll speak after
I want
you.
to force you. I don't. Okay.
I'll just want to remind everyone you can all jump in. Don't be too polite. Go on.
All right. Well, I like what David has said there, and I think that's broader than just simply the Muslim community. That's really any disaffected community out there. I mean, people who have been living in maybe the LGBT community or living in any of the kind of secular parts, maybe an atheist community. They need to know that there is a community out there that will support them and rally around them because. Heck, even a lot of my folks. I mean, things are getting interesting with my own family because I got more serious about my faith, So, and they were, lukewarm Christians. So, I think that's part of it. But I think again, there's an opportunity there because the state, as things are going, it's going to fall apart. And one of the things that it co-opted from Christians, as David kind of was alluding to, is the first century stuff. Christians were the ones out there caring for the poor, the sick, the elderly, the widows, and all these things. And that was very attractive to Christianity for a lot of folks for that reason, especially women. And so we need to kind of take that mantle up when the state starts to kind of fall apart. They should be looking to Christians. So Christians are the ones that have can fill that role. So like when people are looking to where do we turn to, where do we look for help, they can see that the church is there for them. And so that will pull people to the church. And that's the thing that's always been true. The church gets stronger in difficult times because they're looking for salvation. And people get humbled and they go, now I can't do my own self-salvation. So now I will humble myself and look upwards to God. So I think there's strength in that as well. It's just a matter of us being ready to take advantage of those opportunities. So.
Thank you very much. Vocab, did you want to come in on something? And then David kind of jumped in. You're on mute, bro.
Sorry, I'm sorry about that. Yes, but let me hold off on a second. I had to take care of my dogs. They started barking, and I had to take care of some stuff. But I mean, one thing I'll say is this. Now, this is going back a little bit here. Is I like the full-orbed approach. So. In apologetics, you don't often hear discussion about importance of the arts or the creative aspects and things like that. And I'll just say that's one thing that I'm glad to hear and I agree with, because these are culture producing elements. They're culture shaping and crafting elements. These are culture forming. Obviously, they're expressions of culture when you talk about various facets of art, but they're significant. And I think it's important for Christian artists to understand that, sometimes you get wacky people writing on Christianity and the arts, and it doesn't necessarily help. But there's also some really good people who write on this topic. I mean, he's dead now, but Francis Schaeffer, great stuff, I think, in regards to these questions and these issues. And sometimes people, everything can be overemphasized, right? But also everything can be underemphasized. And so the arts at times have been overemphasized, and I think they've also been underemphasized. They're not our savior alone, but it is part of it. It is part of it. And, some of you guys are saying some things. I'm like, I wonder if some of my theonomist friends would like this conversation. I'm not a theonomist, but being Reformed, I have friends who are, and some of the things you guys are saying are interesting to where I wonder if I could just see a theonomist listening, that's what we've been saying all along. Now, like I said, I'm not saying that I don't think the theonomy solution is the solution per se, and I know it's not a discussion about that.
Could you just explain theonomy to those that may not know?
Yes, sometimes it's called Christian Reconstruction or Reconstructionism, and the simple idea of it is rule by God's law. Now, no Christian really, I would hope, would disagree if that's all it was, right? Rule by God's law. But there's sort of a modern element to it, say within the past 50 to 60 years, specifically, especially in American evangelicalism, but more specifically, American Calvinistic evangelicalism. And the idea is that the world of every aspect should be reconstructed under Christ's lordship. And again, some people might say, okay, so far so good. But what that means is that when you say every area, we're talking social, art, education, music, family, military, we're not talking about on an individual level. We're talking about essentially restoration of Old Testament civil and moral laws in order to reconstruct whatever the given society would be, in this case, usually U.S., first, into almost a modern day mosaic form of government and these spheres of influence or spheres of sovereignty: family, government, church. And so because the Bible is the sole standard, that's what you model it after. And that includes punishment for lawbreakers. And a lot of times that's sort of the sensationalistic element of it, because you would have, under some versions of theonomy or Reconstructionism, you would have death penalty for idolaters, murderers, abortionists, people who practice homosexuality or bestiality, rapists, adulterers. And so some people have lesser versions. For example, they'll talk about, and these are real discussions. I know some of this may say, wait, what? That sounds like Sharia for Christians. But obviously there's some differences. Some people will say things like, you would have an island, and I'm just telling you discussions that I've heard. An island where homosexuals are banished, almost like excluded from, kind of sort of a casting out, a modern day excommunicated from the community in that way. And so that's the short version of it. Now, there's different versions and varieties, and the theonomists have actually fought amongst themselves, kicking this guy out, kicking that guy out. But they've also, to a certain extent, tried to establish communities from time to time, to a certain extent, to greater or lesser degrees. Vallecito, California; Tyler, Texas; the folks outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And a closest modern day version that maybe more people are familiar with would be what they're trying to do to a certain extent in Moscow, Idaho, with Doug Wilson. And you can actually read articles where the secular media gets afraid of that every now and then, because you'll see them saying things like they're trying to take over the city council or the board of education. Very interesting stuff. And again, I'm Reformed, but not a theonomist in the strict sense of how these folks would define it. But I could see theonomists listening, and I could see people being attracted to it, especially into the certain cultural climate we're talking about. But that's just a monkey wrench. But it was just
something to me, Vocab. You sold it to me.
I sold it. Well, there's the details. So who governs these governors? And is heresy, Christian heresy, is it punishable? And this is a very real thing. And what I mean by that is, let's say the Baptists are in charge. Is credo baptism, holding to that, preaching that, promoting that, would that be heresy? And if it is heresy punishable? Should it be punishable? Well, I think these are things that have really happened in society, of course. But go ahead.
I do want to bounce back on that, but I am also conscious that I think Chris has been a polite Englishman and he wanted to say something, but then held back. And I want to say it again, guys. Don't wait. If you need to jump in on something, get in there. Go on.
I'm going to jump in. Yeah, sure. So I just want to echo part of what you were saying in the beginning, Vocab, and I think a bit of what John you were saying as well. The importance of arts is cannot be underestimated. But I think there's another aspect of looking at this that I think we've kind of missed, and this is kind of more how we organize and how we portray ourselves. If you look historically at certain civil rights movements that gained a lot of traction, I'm talking about things like Stonewall, for example. They managed to
explain what Stonewall is to people that don't know what Stonewall is. Please.
That is a good point. All right. Okay. So I'm pretty sure you guys have Stonewall in the US as well as in the UK. I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's
didn't it start here? Isn't Stonewall from New York in the United States?
Right. Wasn't it from San Francisco? Actually, I thought
no, New York City. No. So it was a gay bar. The cops raided it, but this time instead of going along, they actually fought back, and it turned into a multi-hour struggle. And they view that as the beginning of the gay rights movement, Stonewall.
Right, interesting. So right, yeah. As Vocab explained, it's the gay rights movement, or the origins, particularly of the gay rights movement. And what you notice is they started to change their tactics, because what we had was one side that was particularly conservative, moralistic, quite bland, not particularly producing much art or nothing really new in that way, nothing innovative. And you contrasted this with very colorful, very fun, very lively, sort of more like festival-like portrayals. And you ended up with effectively people wanting to be a part of that community, even though they had nothing to do with that community, because it was just more engaging, because it was just more real to what the modern world was at the time. And it wasn't just defined by what it was against, it was actively saying something. So I think in the same way, through art, we need to be engaging by making things that are entertaining. And I think we do that partially through what a lot of us do here on YouTube. We make these videos, we engage, and also we both critique opposing ideologies, but we also advocate for the gospel at the same time. And I think by doing that and doing that more visibly, and I think in all honesty, the easiest way to start doing that probably is online. And we have a vacuum, right? I think, like John was saying, there are, or that perhaps you were alluding to, there are certain parts of the modern world that are falling right now. I honestly believe that because of the spread of the internet and because of the spread of alternative ideas, I guess you could call it, you can look at the Jordan Peterson stuff, you can look at the manosphere, we're starting to see things like feminism questioned at a level that it's never really been questioned at before. And people are turning away from this, and they're embracing what I would actually say, quite simply, is a traditional perspective that has its roots fundamentally in Judeo-Christian values. And no one really understands this. I don't think people have quite got to that point yet. They understand it's traditional, but they don't know where it comes from. And so we have this great opportunity to say, hey, you know how you were seeing all this crazy feminist stuff, and they were, perhaps you were looking at the progressive idea that there isn't such a thing between man and woman. Can men get pregnant? People know intuitively that that's all nonsense. And then you simply say, well, what's the truth then? And they'll just say, well, obviously there's a distinction between man and woman. Obviously men can't get pregnant. It's like, right. Do you understand that there's been a long history we have that has advocated for this position? And it's been the position of the church that we say there is a difference between men and women. We value men and women differently, and yet in a way that bestows equal honor upon both sexes. And we want to show you what that looks like in practice, because we want to live it out. And how do we live it out? Well, that's another question. Lots of different answers to that. But one way is through how we present online, like how we present our videos, how we make content that's engaging and interesting, right? And that's how we spread that message. And I think that's an amazing opportunity.
Benedict option. Sorry, just had to clear. Sorry, John. I will let you jump in afterwards, but I just want to think that I want to throw a few more things out there. as you've been talking, I've been thinking, and I think that we need to not make the same mistake that has happened with Nigerian Christians. That when Nigeria became independent, the Christians tried to maintain a secular state, whilst the Muslims tried to create an Islamic state. And trying to maintain the status quo is harder than taking the initiative. And I think it's a mistake to rest your aspirations on simply maintaining a secular state. I think actually that we should be pushing towards a new Christendom and envisioning what a new Christendom looks like. In terms of solutions, I would say that, and this is again to try and stimulate conversation, is that we should actually be thinking seriously about how do we set up defense forces? How do we set up means to defend our own community? And how do we cultivate greater solidarity amongst ourselves as Christians, internationally, nationally, locally, within your own city? And how do we gain influence over government so that government will side essentially with the Christian message, the Christian church? The thing is that the church can only help other people. I think it was John that mentioned this, that, you know, we should be there. We should be the group that people come to, and that we should be able to help them. But we can't do that until we learn to help ourselves. How can we help, you know, and when we've got poor in our own churches that aren't being cared for, elderly in our own churches that aren't being cared for, Christians that are being harassed and intimidated that we're not able to defend. How can we help anyone if we can't help ourselves? And I think a lot of this comes down to embracing a fullness of the Christian identity, and recognizing that Christian identity is not just limiting it to what you believe or a couple of values. It's what you believe, all Christian values, an ethical system, and a sense of being rooted in a certain history. And that needs to be part of the solution. We talked about art a lot, and I definitely agree that's part of the solution. Just to add to that, a great example is just go and look at all the pro-life art and how pro-life movement has engaged in the battle of culture using art, and how successful the pro-life movement has been in winning ground for their own thing. And my final point, I'll shut up and let John speak, is there's a great opportunity for Christians to evangelize amongst conservatives. Because if there's any group in our society that is most keenly aware of the topic that we're talking about and all its various different dimensions, it's conservatives. And there's a great harvest to be won amongst conservatives and those on the right of spectrum in Western culture. I'm going to shut up now. John, and then whoever else.
Sure. Well, I was liking what Chris said. I think part of the solution is, from a kind of apologetic standpoint, is making arguments that are kind of show natural law, that are appealing simply beyond the Christian rubric, that will point people towards Christianity if they go down that path. And I think we see the powerfulness of that. The challenge again is that, even like what he said, you know, what is a woman, and answering these questions, people are cowed into silence because of other groups. So that means that some Christians have to be kind of these culture martyrs, where they're willing to go out on that hill and say these things strongly, assertively, so people can rally around them, and that we have to protect them so that when they get attacked, they'll be able to continue. We got to be like Stephen when he's speaking out against his Jews, and he's got the face like an angel, and he doesn't care because he fears God more than man, and that, you know, that'll carry the day as far as that goes. In terms of beyond that, I think that really is part of it. Is you have to have Christians that people know they truly believe that. I mean, why am I now street preaching where 4 or 5 years ago that would have been ridiculous to me? I never would have thought that. I would have been like, weekends ago, it's under 30 degrees. I wouldn't want to go outside. Last thing I want to do, but I'm doing that now. Why? Because of the influence of God in my life. And so when more people see that and start to believe that, they'll encourage them to want to believe. They'll want to look into it more, and so they can walk away from some of the what I'll call like the social club Christianity that we have in the West that I grew out of. To give them something to believe in. And if it starts with the believing in a Christian who's strong about that, then over time that can become their own faith in Christ as well. And so I think part of that is it. I know I'm preaching to the choir here as far as that type of message. And but I think that's the part of it. And certainly we can make inroads with Christians, but I would not by any means exclude liberals or other folks, because some of these other methods that we're doing when we're caring for other people, when they see people that we're earnestly contending for the faith, we will reach them by that, seeing that those emotions and that that we're kind of walking the walk, because that's been a lot of criticism. And revival can still happen. I know I've been very pessimistic here, but I still believe that revival can happen, just like it has in history as well. And so I think that we should preach the message to all folks. I think we'll have success with some immigrants that already have that belief in God, but I think you can preach the gospel to Muslim women. They're going to be more willing to hear it because of the issues they deal with in Islam. And so I don't know that we want to ignore or groups, but we might be more strategic in where we evangelize. But like I said, we don't have a lot of Islamic communities where I'm at, so I don't want to tell you how to preach to them either. I feel like it's not my place. So,
can I ask a real quick question, just to you, the Americans here? Do you think that in a certain period of time, the US will eventually have the same issues that the UK does, or France does?
Yeah, you're going to have, and that's part of it. When you guys are talking about, Christians defending themselves and so on, it doesn't seem like that here in the U.S. In the sense that, I mean, it's a big place, and within the country, you have individual states, and those states can sort of do a lot of their own things. And so just to give an example for people who are outside the United States, there's the federal government. That's what's over the entire country. But then things that aren't part of what the federal government does, it's your state that gets to decide that. So like Florida or California or New York, they get to decide a lot of what goes on in their states. And so if you heard very recently about the Roe versus Wade being overturned, that had to deal with abortion, it was basically decades ago, the government stepped in and decided that abortion's a federal issue and everyone has a right to an abortion, and states can tweak it a little bit, but everyone, women have a right to an abortion. And what just happened recently was the Supreme Court said, no, there's actually nothing in the Constitution about abortion being one of the issues that the federal government does. That's a state's issue. The states deal with that. So now with it wasn't that abortion was outlawed or anything. It's just that it fell back to the state. So if a state decides that abortion is illegal, a state can do that. So anyway, the point here is you can sort of decide what rule you want to live under, right? You can, if you really don't like the way things are in New York, you can move to Texas. If you don't like the way things are in Texas, you can move to New York. And so going back to what Bob was saying earlier, about Christians actually, becoming a community and so on, and then Benedict you could actually do that, right? You could say, hey, California's just gone nuts, so I'm going over here. Or if you didn't like Texas, and hey, Texas is too hardcore, you could move over here. And so you could have Christians who sort of get along well as Christians. So you could still do that here. So we're more. That's why I'm way more concerned about just Christians understanding why they're Christians and taking it seriously, because I mean the U.S. government was kind of set up with the main overarching goal of avoiding any person or group forming a tyranny over everyone else. So that's the idea behind the different branches of government, with the executive and the legislative and the judicial, and having a constitution that you can't cross the lines. The government can't cross lines of the rights that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. And at the end of the day, they even thought that if the government eventually does form a tyranny, you have a right to violently overthrow the government. So that all that's built into the idea that people shouldn't have a tyranny over you. And so I think as long as you get people to understand how they're being manipulated and what they need to take seriously, there's still a lot of room for working within this system here in the U.S. And as far as being a Christian, one of the very interesting things was one of the founding fathers of the country, John Adams, when the government was being set up, he said, "This government is designed for a moral and religious people." He said, "It won't work for anyone else. It will not work for anyone else." In other words, the people are still the sort of foundation for society, in the sense of if you get people who are all behaving bad, then they're going to use those freedoms not for good. They're going to use them just for bad, and that will eventually destroy the entire setup. And so it's this situation where when you guys are talking, I don't know if it's just because I'm an American, I'm suspicious about a church taking political power, right? Like, wait, power tends to corrupt. And if you say this church or that church or Christian values or the Bible or whatever, and then they take over, it's the people I don't trust. I mean, if it was Jesus ruling, that would be one thing. If it's a group or something like that, I just get naturally suspicious.
I get what you're saying, but the thing is, if Christians don't rule, Christians will be ruled. And the reality is that we've already seen what anti-Christian progressives can do with government and law against the church. And we've got 1400 years of history to point to of what exactly Islamic rule of the church looks like and results in. And it's not the triumph that Tertullian thought it would be. You know, the blood of the martyrs is not the seed of the church on every occasion. Yeah. And so as Christians, our choice is we rule or we are ruled. And I would rather risk the idea of a bad Christian ruler than a bad anti-Christian ruler.
Well, it's I mean, going along to what I was saying, I mean, if you go back to the New Testament, that Paul's not ruling anything. And he seemed quite content as long as the government is protecting his rights to go around and preach. So what all I'm saying is that as far as a place like the United States, if Christians actually know what they believe and know why they believe it, I think we're good. In other words, that's the main obstacle. Notice, even to have a sort of a Christian ruling party or something like that, in order to get to that, you'd have to have a sort of like a weird kind of Christian revival. But if you got anything remotely resembling a Christian revival where people understand what they believe, why they believe it, and they can defend it, at least here, I think we're good, because you would then influence the government, and you would have people there. And so I don't think we need to take over the government or anything like that. The government is built up to where people can influence it for the good. It's just certain ideas have gone absolutely great. And I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, modern Western society is a case of Christian values gone mad. Right? You take a certain idea, which tolerance is a good idea. And if it's like, hey, we're not going to murder each other over these disagreements and so on, it's good that we respect that, that you're the image of God and I'm the image of God. And so we're going to be careful about how we navigate these disagreements and so on. That sort of thing is good, but you can run to an insane extreme with it. And that's what you have. And Chesterton pointed out that the values are all detached from each other. It's not that, hey, these are the values that emerge out of a common understanding. It's here's tolerance, and this can, this is at war with all other values, and this value over here, and that's at war with all other values, and you're going to pick the one that you like best, and so on. So, yeah, I think it comes down to basically an informed population of free people. I think if you have an informed population of free people, especially with Jesus as their authority in their lives, I think everything else works out. But the point is, we don't have that. We don't have.
I agree, and I don't want to. I can see the danger of me and you going backwards and forwards and easily using up the last 20 minutes. There's a lot that I would want to talk and explore with you on that. But I just want to give space to the people if there's anyone wants to jump in on anything that they've heard or said or come up with any other thoughts.
I do, but I think it's just going to make this conversation go on more. So
no, go for it. All
right, real quick. So in which case, yeah, I kind of agree more with David here. I think that if you have a population that is rightfully equipped, either with proper Christian belief, which is ideal and what we all desire, but even failing that, if they have just simply the moral traditions and values of Christians, then ultimately you're not going to end up in a position where you're ruled by a progressive who no longer believes men and women are real. You'll end up with someone who's not a Christian, unfortunately, but they still hold the same values that you do and still believe men and women are real. They may even have traditional values, like they may say homosexuality is not a good thing in and of itself. They may do that, and I think that's still 1,000 times better than a progressive left or a Marxist left or an Islamic ruling government, whatever that might look like. I think that, to quote Andrew Breitbart, politics is downstream from culture, and I think if you change the culture, you'll ultimately change the politics.
Hold on one second, though, because both of you, the whole point of your thesis assumes that Christianity has become prevalent in culture, and if it's become prevalent in culture, it would be fair to assume that there would be a lot more Christians, and therefore it would be fair to assume that there would be a lot more Christians in politics. Now, I think I want to be clear in my argument that I don't think that one church, one institutional denomination should rule the state. I think the whole body of Christ, there should be no denominational filters to government, but Christians should be preeminent in politics, and we should be governing and ruling by a Christian political narrative.
That's
and I don't think, and I think that I think the Presbyterians who set up the colonies in America and influenced American culture to come up with a masterpiece of political artwork, the American Constitution, and it really is. They were governed by their non-conformist experiences in England, but those are different challenges and different threats in a way to particularly the cultural battle that's being lost in America to the progressives, and the progressives will lose it to the Islamists.
Yeah. Well, I would say a couple of things. Is it's also important to matter when our country was founded, at the time when those things were written, and we're having the not wanting any group to kind of reign supreme over the other groups. We were over like 98% Protestant, and that was at a time when that meant something and people were serious about their faith. So the founding fathers, 51 of the 55, were Christians of some denomination, and the other 4 were, I think, deists. And so we live in a different time now. I mean, you mentioned it when you said, like, they take those Christian ideas and they talk about tolerance or anti-racism, these things, which are good, but they leave behind God, which is what spirals out of control, why there's not a cohesiveness of it. You can't be good without God, in other words. And so that's the difficulty, right? So trying to hold on to that secular mess is a little more complex, because we've kind of moved away from that. And so I don't know that we can kind of hold on to the secular idea, because even at this beginning, we still have that Christian background, even if it didn't say, okay, so we follow the Presbyterian background as opposed to the Methodist background or Baptist, or that wasn't as much of a concern as it was just some generally agreed upon things. But as the culture has shifted, we've say we, not us, but others have kind of abandoned that God focus, and so I don't know. I think there's a little more to that.
I see Vocab Malone. He's busy looking at screens and things. So you're pulling up some killer quote, or you're playing some computer game over there?
I don't think I have any killer quotes. I'm kind of always, I guess, doing that multitasking. It's interesting. This is taking us off a little bit. You guys know I deal, some of you may know I deal with a group called the Hebrew Israelites, which are in the UK. You guys have probably seen some of them at Speaker's Corner, and sometimes harassing the Jewish people as they go to their supermarkets and things like that. But some of them have actually taken some of these ideas more, though, from kind of like what you might consider the survivalist or the prepper community, as it's sometimes called online. And some of these groups have bought land, so they've pooled their resources together, bought land, usually moved out to rural areas, and then really built these communities from the ground up. And it's not the majority yet. They usually don't have enough resources and organization and, frankly, life experience to do some of this. But one in particular is a group called Straightway Truth Ministries, led by actually a veteran. He was in the armed services, used to jump out of airplanes, as he's keen to tell people. And he is named Pastor Charles Dow, and he's taken a number of people out into various places. For example, rural Alabama, I believe, rural Tennessee is the biggest one. And he's got a number of former NFL players. And I'm not saying they fund all of it, but some of these NFL players certainly are part of funding these ventures, and they've started communities out there. And it's interesting, out of all the people that you might think would take an interest in this, because these folks also, I don't want to say stockpile weapons. That gives visions of David Koresh or something, and I don't like what the government did there, so I don't want to give the government any ideas, but definitely have some weapons on hand and train in how to use them, but as self-defense, somewhat similar to what maybe Bob is saying, not as a means of aggression or attack. But out of all the people that have taken interest, it's been Sports Illustrated. I've been contacted twice by Sports Illustrated to comment on this particular group. The first time was a multi-series online article, and the next is for a podcast they're doing coming out next year. And we're talking one of those multi-part, the kind of trendy podcasts where it's like this really produced thing, multiple parts. And so it's interesting to see. And you always wonder, at least I do, I sit around and say, will there ever come some kind of strange, what I've heard some say, ecumenicism of the trenches, meeting in the minds, where you have groups like, I don't think this is going to happen. I'm just saying, you have these Hebrew Israelites with Christians with other groups, and are like, hey, we need to all do this. But it wouldn't really work, obviously, if they were all in the same community. So they end up having their separate communities. But it's an interesting thing to think. There are other people thinking about this, and you see some of that. But it seems like the Islamic way is much different. It is infiltration. It's not really, let's go do a thing over here. And there's a lot to consider, because part of the problem with some of these ideas, or the challenge, I'll say, is even if we say this is the right course of action, part of the challenge would be then convincing other Christians that this is the right course of action, this is the right view, and then actually then doing it. So saying this is no longer an idea, here's where we are at, here's what we're doing. A number of things. I don't have any ready solutions. I probably, but I do like hearing these discussions, because I think it's stuff that Christians don't always think about. But it's very, very, very interesting topics. I didn't know it was going to take some of these turns, but I'm just more trying to contribute overall to the conversation rather than making some definitive point right there, but just throwing some different factors into the conversation as I hear us going along. Sorry, I don't have a killer quote.
No, it's fine. I know you're multitasking over there. I saw you flipping screens and working things, so I thought you were coming out with some killer point. But you're right.
You really let us down with that
Yeah.
Complete lack of killer quotes.
Yeah, that was a how to end on a dud. No, but like I mean, you're right. I think we should have gyms and fight clubs in every church, and we should teach men to be men, and we should embrace masculine energy, but we should cultivate it within the chivalric code. So we're not creating thugs, we're not creating brutes who just go out and be cruel and savage, but we create knights. And not in some silly way that they dress up in armor, but that they embrace both the idea that of warrior and scholar, of warrior and gentleness at the same time. Because I think that we're coming to a point where either the liberal society will just, certainly in some parts of Europe, but maybe France might be an example, or the Netherlands, or even sadly possibly England, where either liberal culture will just completely cave, and you'll just see it like it did, it'll just suddenly flip over to Islam, or there will be a breakdown of social order. And I particularly think that might happen in France, where the state cannot fully control what is happening, and therefore the church needs to be able to. That's when it comes to that point where people will go, where do I turn to? And the church has got to be ready to step into the vacuum of the state's failings. There you go. Just throwing that out into the mix. I'll throw out some of the stuff. Maybe I'll get some more conversation out of you guys.
Maybe are you talking about like what we saw when the Roman Empire fell? And, we kind of saw the Christian church fill in the gap.
Look at all the ingredients. All the ingredients are the same. Mass migration occurred at the collapse of the Roman Empire. We've got mass migration going on right now. You've the possibility of disruption on some very key things. Can form the catalyst. There's a lot going on, but there are a lot of the same trends.
Yeah, I mean, I could see some parallels in situations or civilizations. It's tough though. Even there, there's the one positive element. The church was sort of the only organic organism, for lack of a better word, to fill the gap in certain ways. But then it maybe filled the gap in ways that you wish it hadn't, because it's hard for me, at least, not to see how that ended up leading directly to the creation of what was called the Holy Roman Empire, which is, historians are keen to say was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, right? And I think there's some truth to that, kind of like saying Christian Science isn't Christian nor science. And so I look at that and I don't think I mainly view the Holy Roman Empire as a good thing.
But the Holy Roman Empire, sorry, I'm jumping in.
But yeah, I was throwing it out at you, so that's okay.
The Holy Roman Empire, part of the reason for the creation of the Holy Roman Empire is because the Goths and the Visigoths, when they invaded Western Europe, they were Arians. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't the case that it was only the Roman Catholic Church that could have filled the void. There was an Arian population, and part of the reason for the creation of the Holy Roman Empire was to give the church a backer against the Arian church.
Well, weren't they more rural and less cultured?
Yeah, they were barbarians. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's another reason why they lost. But
yeah, and I guess if I have a choice between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire,
there you go.
Choose the Holy Roman Empire. But it's tough because these things never. I don't know how to put it. They never work in perpetuity. And I know no one's saying that, but you go over to like the Byzantine Empire, because I've, for example, heard Douglas Wilson say that's what we need a modern example of, something that is akin to Christendom. And, but then you look at the lessons of history and it held out for a while, but at the end of the day, Constantinople fell and the East fell and the rest of the church long term didn't really help it. It's like
it fell because of the Latins. it fell, and also because
yeah, but they are also fighting with each other. It's not just the West that was at fault.
It was the inability of the Latin West and the Orthodox East to work together that led ultimately to the defeat and the betrayal of the Latins of the East that led to the fall of Constantinople.
Yeah, there's some truth to that, but it's tough because I from what I know, I can't put it all on the Latin Church.
No, not all of it.
As much as a Protestant as I might like to, right? the East, had its own issues and problems and stubbornness, and you had people collaborate with the the Ottoman Empire, and of course, we wouldn't have to deal with these problems, of course, Bob, if Islamic expansion wasn't so aggressive throughout history. It wasn't such a problem. We really shouldn't. In an ideal world, you don't have to think about, how high do we have to build our walls?
But we do, and we still do today. And I guess we're coming into the last 5 minutes, guys, and I don't know whether you want to continue or whether you want to draw it to a close. Either way is fine. I'll leave it open to you to decide what you want to do. But I think, it would be good if in this last 5 minutes, the official last 5 minutes, if you could say one thing, one part of what you think the solution is. And I'll give you a minute or two to think about it. So, take some time to think. This may be an idea that you've sat on for a long time. It may be an idea you've already put out into the discussion. It may be a new idea that's emerged because of the discussion. What one thing do you think Christians can do either collectively or individually to respond to the challenge of Islam? So I'll give you a minute. It's just turned 56, so I'll give a full minute. And if you're ready to come in with something, you don't need to wait. Just jump in and give your one thing.
What if I need a little more than a minute?
You've got a minute.
You can have some of my time, David. You have 30 seconds extra of my time.
I think as far as some of the issues being pointed out, basically, I mean, not even, not trying to diminish a woman's role or anything like that, but men being men. It's like the alternatives right now that are being presented to people with like the Andrew Tate thing and so on is you either have to be this hyper aggressive total scumbag or a doormat for everyone else in the world. And you guys in the West don't like being a doormat. Well, then you gotta convert to Islam, as if there's no in between there. But we see Jesus, right? Didn't back down, always stood his ground, was always challenging hypocrites and oppressors to the point where a ton of people wanted him dead, but he was never a chest thumping, womanizing dirtbag like we're told you have to be if you don't want to be a doormat. And so yeah, I think we need to be strong. And I was just earlier, I was looking at a list. I'll close out with this. The list of survivors of the Titanic. And you look in first class, 97% of women survived first class. 86% of children in first class survived. 32% of men. You go down to second class, 86% of women survived from second class. 100% of children survived from second class. 8% of men survived from second class. And what that means is the men, the people who are best able to survive, because if they want to cast the kids and women aside and jump in the lifeboats, they could. No, the kids wouldn't have been able to stop them. And yet 8% survived to protect 100% of the women, of the kids, and 86% of the women. And what that really means is those guys were in that disastrous situation. Those men were giving their lives. They understood. I'm getting this kid up to that deck and putting him on a lifeboat, and then I'm going down with the ship. And so, point is, I don't think a lot of guys are like that anymore. But still, on some level, that we all understand that's what's right. We should be standing our ground and being men and defending everyone who may not be in a position to defend themselves. And so, yeah, that's one of the main things we have to figure out as Christians how to navigate that, how to be a good Christian man without degenerating into a chest thumping Andrew Tate type.
By the way, that was brilliant, David. You guys, you can make your final point and take as much time as you need to make that final point. Anyone else want to go next?
I will jump in and do my my final wrap up here. I think what everyone has kind of said in some way, shape, or form has been very useful and very constructive to coming up with ways that we can deal with the challenges of Islam. I think being visibly Christian is always something that we need to push more of. I don't know, I can't speak for the US, but for Britain, we always have a case of a lot of sort of undercover Christians, people who are Christian in that they are nominally Christian. But I think there is a way in which we can arise out of that, especially in the masculine spirit, a desire to come out and to be more open about what we say and more targeted towards what we're actually wanting to do. And I've seen this actually with people that I've spoken to. I've seen people who were just, they were Christian because their parents were Christian, but then they started to realize, wait a second, the world is going crazy. There are these ideas that I cannot reconcile in any way, even under the principle of tolerance. It's simply, it self-refutes itself. It's a square circle. I need to come out and I need to do something about it. And what they do is they see visible Christianity. They see, and again, for a masculine side, which is what I'm speaking about in particular here, they see these men who are saying, I know this is a problem. I have an answer to this. I'm willing to stand up publicly for this. I'm willing to create art that's good, that you can share, that you want to share because you're now passionate about it. And I'm going to bring you into this debate. I'm going to bring you into this challenge and I'm going to get you involved. And through that, they start to investigate because they come from a cultural perspective. Like, all these things are being challenged. What do I do? They see the Christian worldview. They go, wow, that stands up for it. I want to be a part of this. I want to be engaged with it somehow. And of course you can say, well, we all come to this position because we have an ultimate love of one another, because the one who died for us gave us that principle, that foundational belief, and we follow it with our hearts. And that is what gives us strength to do this. And seeing this is it's a strong light that shines for people to see, and it draws them in. And I think, at least in the UK, we need more of this. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. That's brilliant. Vocab, John?
Well, if I could go a little meta, conceptual, theological, we've tossed a lot of ideas back and forth, but, regardless of where one settles and what community they're part of as far as how they settle, it's important for Christians to be active and engaged and in a biblical way. So not trying to, Jesus juke anybody, as the term is, but I do want to quote Matthew 5. I like this, and I feel like this is a great guiding principle, regardless of where you settle on some of these issues. And I pray that we do this. Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16, Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." Of course, we could do a whole study on that verse and discuss it, but I want to get a few more out here. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. And I want to thank you guys very much for inviting me. And I apologize, I stepped away a couple times to take care of dogs and things like that. But thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure, Vocab. Pleasure. John?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for also having me on the panel. It was wonderful talking with all of you. It's always a blessing to talk with other Christians. I like what David's example there. He talked about the Titanic and that having that want, that desire to give your life for others. I think that's the example we see in the Bible. But I think it's also important, not just why we have that want. Why is that important for us to want to lay down our lives for our loved ones? And from the Christian perspective, that is because Christ did that for us. We see examples in like John 15:13 says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. And then, of course, the famous verse in Romans 5, but God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. And that's why we do that. That's why our affection is set that way. And so I think it's important to always bring it back to God as our core, and then everything comes out from that. And I think we've lost that a bit in the West, but I'm happy to know there are brothers here that are fighting for that. So that's my closing statement.
Okay, thank you very much. So, one of the themes that's come out very clearly from what you guys have said is that we need to recover a kind of more bolshy, self-confident kind of Christianity. Because if we're going to present an alternative both to liberalism and Islam, we've actually got to know what it means to be a Christian. And I would add on to that, the scriptures by the teachings of the holy apostles say that, you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people set apart. And my kind of final comment is that as Christians, we need to, just take a moment to contemplate everything that a nation is. Go away and study it. Go away and look at what a nation is. As Christians, we need to start to act, and we need to start to organize like a nation within a nation, so that we are different, distinct, and able to mobilize as a nation distinct from civic national identity or civic society. And I would say that would put us in the best place to respond to the multifaceted, multi-layered, multi-dimensional challenge that the Islamic community presents to us. And that is sort of my final point as a speaker. Guys, now with my moderator's hat on, I just want to say thank you again, all of you, so much for taking your time to come and speak with me and, to have this conversation. This is the kind of conversation that the church needs to be having on this topic around the world, but there's other topics that it needs to be talking about as well. We need to cut away the fluffy, limp-wristed, wishy-washy kind of things that churches often take up way too much time thinking about, or pandering to the liberal agenda, and actually think about what, is important to Christians and the church. And this is one of those topics. So thank you very much. I hope that we can all do it again. And if I may take this opportunity just to be a plug my own little thing, which is that, as you guys know, every Christian, as you guys may know, once a month I run a YouTubers network event where YouTubers, Christians who've got a YouTube channel, can all come together, share ideas, talk to one another, and network to increase cooperation. And so if you're a Christian networker, a Christian YouTuber, David, Vocab, you're more than welcome to come to that. And I hope that this will be one of many future collaborations going forward. Does anyone have anything super pressing to say before we finish?
I just said maybe because we kind of skipped over it. Maybe if other folks have some books or other things they're promoting right now or involved in, maybe this would be a good time to let them share that. That's okay.
Yeah, if there's any particular project, book, or thing you want to promote, now's an opportunity. Go for it.
Well, we've recorded some new Boom Boom rooms. So if you're interested in seeing Muhammad interview such people as Andrew Tate, Michael Jackson, R. Kelly, Robert Spencer, and Salman Rushdie, be sure to be on the lookout at Act 17 polemics. Isn't that right, David? I leave anybody out?
Yeah, we got a bunch coming out. To Andrew Tate will probably be the next one. They're gonna discuss their view of women.
That sounds
Classic.
amazing.
Yep. We had to rewrite the script there so it could be PG-13, I think.
Yeah, we had to vocab. I thought it was totally normal stuff, but vocab, he had to he had to veto some of the stuff Andrew Tate was saying because it was too. It was actually too horrible.
If you guys think I'm bad, sometimes I have to act as Jiminy Cricket to David's Pinocchio.
Yeah, little goody two shoes, watering everything down.
That's my job.
I cannot wait. That sounds amazing.
Anything else?
Nah.
No? Yes?
So I'm going to jump in and simply say, again, to anyone who doesn't know, there is now a Soco app that you can get on Android and soon to be available on iOS. This is an app that certain individuals like me and Bob have been involved in for creating content that explains core doctrines. Like at the moment we have the Trinity, and this is something that you can use in your evangelistic efforts, whether that's on the streets or with family and friends. And it's a great utility to read, to whip out whenever you need to when you're having these important conversations. And yeah, I would encourage you all to get it. It is called the Soco.
Oh no, I was going to ask you to say the name, but you're going to do it.
Yeah.
How do you spell it? Yeah.
So Soco, SOCO, and then the British spelling of the word armory. So if I don't U, yeah, there's a U in there. OURY.
Okay.
Yeah,
should check it out.
Incidentally, guys, is the correct spelling of the word armory.
Yes, it is. Yes, indeed.
Much like the British monarchy, we find the U useless.
the good comeback. Yes, Soco Armory, people. You can download it on Android, and it will soon be available on iPhone. Okay, guys. Anything else? That's the one.
Nice, great stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and if there's nothing else, I'm going to close in a prayer, and then we'll end the live stream there. Okay. O Christ our God, who at all times and in every hour, in heaven and on earth, are worshipped and glorified, who are long-suffering, merciful and compassionate, who love the just and show mercy upon the sinner, who call all to salvation through the promise of blessings to come. O Lord, in this hour receive our supplications and direct our lives according to your commandments. Sanctify our souls, hallow our bodies, correct our thoughts, cleanse our minds. Deliver us from all tribulation, evil, and distress. Encompass us with your holy angels that, guided and guarded by them, we may attain to the unity of the faith and to the knowledge of your unapproachable glory. For your blessed, into the ages of ages, world without end. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. I'm going to end the live stream there, guys. Hold on, don't all disappear. Good night, guys. Wherever you are in the world, or good morning, or good afternoon. Peace of the Lord be with you all.